After the release of Dead Island, Techland felt that the game didn't meet its full potential, so the core team decided to part ways to begin working on what would eventually be known as Dying Light, an open world parkour survival game with melee focused combat complete with skill trees that affect aspects of the player character, weapon types with varying stats and increased rarity. To celebrate, we look back on not only one of the best zombie games that released during the 2010s, a time when the genre itself was starting to become stale, but also one of the best games of all time. This is Dying Light. For feedback, Techland looked at Dead Island's shortcomings to improve on for Dying Light. Dead Island's melee focused combat was janky, sluggish shite, whereas Dying Light is more refined and responsive mainly because of its punchy feedback. Slicing and dicing through hordes of the undead hadn't felt this satisfying since Dead Rising. The guns got a significant upgrade this time round as well. The guns in Dead Island weren't the worst, but it honestly felt like you were handling a pea shooter, but thankfully that isn't the case here. Even the pistol does a pretty good job at dispatching enemies, both zombies and looters. Even when you find two-handed firearms, you don't need to necessarily worry about your movement speed being reduced, since the game allows you to scale rooftops with relative ease. The main selling point of Dying Light was of course parkour. Parkour games were seen as a rarity in gaming, at least first-person ones. You had Assassin's Creed, but the last FPS-focused parkour game that released 7 years before was Mirror's Edge, which Techland took a lot of inspiration from. If Mirror's Edge parkour was all about form, Dying Light is all about function due to its intuitive design and control scheme. By the start of the game, your parkour skills are weak, but by the end, you'll transform into a parkouring god. Of course, you can't have a tightly put together parkour system without a well-rounded city to explore, and Dying Light doesn't disappoint. The city of Haran is wholly unique, a haunting and dangerous place, yet a visually beautiful location due to the game's art direction and lighting. The game's two main areas are comprised of the claustrophobic slums, which is where you'll spend most of your time until the second act, where you'll arrive to the Old Town, a sprawling location with tall buildings with more complex rooftops, opening up more opportunities compared to the previous. Running across the city's rooftops after setting up a waypoint to the highest point of the game and reaching it to admire the game's iconic sunlight is still to this day a rewarding venture. The game's atmosphere is indeed unnerving and creepy, but once you find yourself out of reach from any form of danger, it can turn from terrifying to calming. But eventually, you're going to want to make a trek back home. As the game's tagline goes, good night, good luck. Night is your worst enemy. The undead become far more aware of you with increased aggression, but they are a mere pushover compared to the real horror, the volatile.
Okay, boys, set the terror level at code brown, cause I need to change my pants.
Techland made the rather creative decision by having nighttime offer more XP for your character, giving you more incentive to venture out, opting for a risk-reward philosophy. Like Dead Island, Dying Light's story often feels non-existent, due to any lack of significant character other than the player character, Kyle Crane, voiced by the ever-likeable Roger Craig Smith in one of his most vulgar roles. Having met the man himself, Roger had a lot of fun voicing Crane, and his line delivery is just perfect.
Get here. Do it! Fuck you, asshole. You want me to make my own rules? Rule number 1. You're gonna spend the rest of your goddamn life in fucking agony. I'm shouting because this fucked up infected motherfucker with guts hanging out of his mouth just spit a bunch of toxic snot at me. God, take your vengeance. Will you just shut the fuck up?
The main baddie, Reyes, is the only other character I can pick out since the writers opted to make him a terrible Vars ripoff, and the fact that the final confrontation with him is a sea of QuickTime events, which has aged about as well as Ubisoft's game design. Nobody played Dying Light for the story. The story sucks, but I will admit that some of the missions are inherently fun most of the time. Most noticeably, one that involves breaking into a school to scout for a weapons cache. Aside from the obvious creep factor, what makes this level brilliant is the music that plays when shit hits the fan, and like the rest of the soundtrack, it's a banger. In the years after release, Techland would provide constant support for the game, continuously evolving the gameplay mechanics with updates to parkour, weapons, and adding an additional category to the skill menu. A year later, the biggest addition was the game's major expansion, The Following, and expansion would be the correct term. Not only does it include a new story, but an entirely new location to explore out in the countryside. Although there is a lack of buildings this time round, Techland introduced your own customizable buggy to roam around in with its own skill tree to boot. The Following introduces so many new elements that it could be considered its own game, similar to Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare. The story takes place shortly after the game's base story. With Reyes dead and Crane willingly staying behind to help survivors, efforts to conjure up a cure are unsuccessful, but after hearing words of a cult outside of Haran being immune to the virus, Crane goes out and investigates. The Following offers a much better story this time round, mainly because it sets up an intriguing mystery as to whether or not the cult is indeed immune, and adds further context as to what the virus is and its many evolutionary changes, all of which culminates in some pretty substantial revelations and decision making you yourself would have to make. A sequel would eventually follow, but I'll keep this short. Dying Light 2 is one of the most disappointing games I've ever played, and one of the worst sequels in both story and gameplay. Dying Light 1 was and still is a mechanically sound and wonderfully designed game with many enjoyable and rewarding elements that made it a beloved game. Dying Light 2 on the other hand takes all that was good about the first game and throws it into the deepest depths, never to be seen again. The combat is worse, the story is worse as it desperately tries to sell you in on it, and the RPG mechanics are so half-arsed it makes Fallout 4's look like a masterpiece by a country ass mile. Sequel aside however, 10 years on I am still playing Dying Light religiously. I love this game, and as one of the first next gen games I personally bought for myself, this game has been one of the best investments I've ever put into a game. Alongside a great single player offering, it's also a riot with friends, and there are also many laughs to be had, and I have now, for a decade. Running around Haran with a group of friends is a hilarious, if often broken experience. Dying Light is one of the best, hands down. It has its issues, but I appreciate everything that Techland did with this game. If for some odd reason you haven't checked the game out, you can buy it for dirt cheap, and there is at least 200 plus hours worth of content here alone, if not more, with a dedicated group of friends. I'm going to miss this game a lot, and even though the sequel sucked, there does appear to be some hope on the horizon, but we're just gonna have to wait and see.